literal shin kicking. People would wear hardened leather boots, sometimes even wooden clogs. And the goal is to kick your opponent's shins so hard that they bleed or even break.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm thrilled to welcome Oz back to the show. Oz, last time we talked, it was about HEMA, or the historical European martial arts. And now we're going to pivot hard to catch wrestling, which you also have a ton of experience in and a context for. So I find that's a really interesting area of the martial arts to explore.
At the risk of kind of spoilering the whole episode, I don't think it's much of a pivot at all.
Okay. Well, explain.
Well, I mean, my personal journey, it just all fits together beautifully. We talked a lot about the kind of the different styles of HEMA, the things I was doing, the source material I was looking at, Regency bare knuckle boxing, traditional folk wrestling, Cumberland and Westmoreland wrestling, that kind of thing. And catch wrestling is in all those historical books too. And there's a really clear association with kind of these historical styles and catch wrestling. So for me, I discovered it through books and was trying to work out what it was from this original source material, and obviously not doing a particularly good job because I got my ass handed to me quite thoroughly when I actually found real catch wrestling. But by the by, I heard about this old man who'd done catch wrestling when he was a kid in a little gym in Wigan, and he was coming back to the UK, so I went along. I thought it'd be really interesting to see if what he was doing had any relevance or looked like what these books said. And that was Billy Robinson. And
who's a bit of a legend.
Well, yeah.
Why is he a legend?
Absolutely. He's the guy that's responsible for Sakuraba and numerous other people. But it just, I mean, my world changed overnight. I drove, I don't know, maybe 300 miles, and I did a 3-hour seminar with him and a bunch of professional fighters. And I was, I won't say gifted amateur. I was an out and out amateur, and I was going along just for the ride, just to see what it was. And I spent 3 hours getting thoroughly beaten up, and I walked away absolutely hooked. And suddenly there was this thing that it was an English martial art, and it worked. A genuine English martial art with lineage that produced people like Sakuraba and Josh Barnett and some of these, amazing fighters. And and that's kind of how I got into it, and I've been hooked ever since.
Well, I think we've are telling the story a bit backwards. Why don't we start at the beginning and then work our way to training with Billy Robinson and the connection? Obviously, all cultures have some form of wrestling. I mean,
yes.
If you go to Turkey, if you go to Greece, if you go to Switzerland, they all have their indigenous forms of wrestling.
Yes, absolutely.
What are the indigenous forms of wrestling of England?
Well, that's a question I've been trying to answer for a long time. We know very clearly what people were doing in the 1800s because we've got a lot of documentary evidence that demonstrates it. But there was a really clear move to kind of sanitize wrestling and fighting at that point. So you get things like the Cumberland and Westmoreland Wrestling Society based out of London that's effectively pushing this very technical, very limited style. And you'll get Cornish wrestling and Devonshire wrestling and catch wrestling in Lancashire, which was considered a little bit brutal because you didn't stop when you hit the ground. And when you try and look further back, it becomes really difficult to find out any concrete evidence. We know that there was something called up and down fighting in the north of the country predominantly, not limited to Lancashire, but pretty close. And that involved purring, which was a type of shin kicking. It also included something that sounds very much like headbutting, which was also sometimes called purring, just to confuse things. But it also included a lot of ground fighting. And there are some some documents, some evidence there that suggests that people fought until someone gave in. So not necessarily tapping to a submission, but certainly getting to a point where you realized you weren't going to get up again, or you'd had enough, or you just, you accepted that you lost, or something significant broke. And we know that's a thing, but it's really hard to find much evidence on what that is, because there was this concerted effort to portray it as this brutal, barbaric thing that real gentlemen didn't do.
Was that part of the push for boxing? Is boxing more civilized than
absolutely, yeah,
this wrestling business?
To a degree, because there was quite a lot of grappling in boxing at that period. When you're looking in the late 1700s, the early 1800s, then you were just as likely to win a boxing match by throwing your opponent as you were by hitting them. From what we can tell, up and down fighting is very similar to what the Americans had in rough and tumble. But again, we don't know a huge amount about that. And then there's not an awful lot in the record at all. And we go kind of end up back in the medieval period looking at illustrated manuscripts and trying to find out what people were doing based on the beautiful little marginalia, the pictures that monks were doing in the bare spaces around the things they were writing. And there's quite a lot of wrestling imagery in that. We see some loose grip wrestling, and we see some close grip, something like Cumberland and Westmoreland. But we see an awful lot of something that doesn't really have a name, but it's become known as scarf wrestling, which is effectively you both have a scarf around your neck and you hold the other person's scarf, and then you wrestle. We don't have any rules for it. We don't know how it was done, but you can kind of see certain potential techniques when you look at some of the pictures. You can see how you can use the scarf to break someone's posture or to move them around, or much in the same way that you use the lapels of a gi jacket. And that's kind of it. So we know there's definitely a number of ancient styles of wrestling that are indigenous to the British Isles. More than that, it's hard to say. It's a very messy history, and people have tried to rewrite it many times over the last couple of centuries.
Well, when we get to the 1800s and we actually have documentation of the Westmoreland wrestling and the various styles of wrestling, can you just quickly take us through an overview of what those styles would have looked like?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just to give a sense of the diversity of ways that people end up trying to...
So you have Cornish and Devonshire, which tend to be lumped together. They're slightly different in that Devonshire wrestling tends to involve a lot of kicking, and Cornish tends not to. But effectively,
when you say kicking, do you mean like a foot sweep where you don't mind?
Literal shin kicking. People would wear hardened leather boots, sometimes even wooden clogs. And the goal is to kick your opponent's shins so hard that they bleed or even break. But obviously what tends to happen is as soon as you start kicking at people's shins, they tend to move their legs. And that allows you to then set up position changes and hopefully then throws. But in both instances, they'd wear a special linen jacket with kind of rope closings on the front, and you grab the jacket and you have to be holding the jacket to throw your opponent. In Cornish wrestling, the idea is that the four corners of your back, so your shoulder blades and the points of your pelvis, are the 4 points. And if you land somebody flat on all four, it's a full back. If you land them on 3, then that's also counted a win. If you land them on 2, then you get up and you fight again. And one old Cornish guy I was chatting to many years ago jokingly said that there was also the Mevagissey back. Now, Mevagissey is a town in Cornwall, and they used it as a kind of insulting term for when you attempt to throw somebody and somehow they either turn or you mess it up and they land on their front. So there's no points at all, because apparently the people from Mevagissey were terrible at wrestling. I don't know if it's true or not, but it's something that kind of tickled me at the time, and it's always stuck with me. So that's Cornish.
So you had to have a grip, and it looks kind of like judo.
Yeah, very much so. Yes, absolutely. one of the really cool things about it is that Cornish wrestling, the judges would hold long sticks, and they'd use them to kind of push the fighters apart or to break it up if there was an issue. And they were known as sticklers, which is where the phrase "a stickler for the rules" comes from. I don't know if that's a phrase you use in Canada.
Yes.
We use it all the time in the UK, but yeah, that comes from traditional Cornish wrestling.
That's so cool.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lovely amount of etymology stuff, just cool words that come from combat sports, but that's essentially Cornish wrestling. Interestingly, it shares a lot of parallels with Breton wrestling from northern France. And for a while, I don't know if they still do, but for a while, teams from Brittany and from Cornwall would get together and compete because they were essentially doing exactly the same thing. But
there was a time when that part of France was part of England.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I think it dates back even further than that, to be honest. I suspect it's older because that corner, that Cornwall and part of Devon, that was effectively where the indigenous people were pushed back into the far edges, like up into Scotland, across into Wales, and down into Cornwall when first the Romans and then the Saxons and Angles came over. And the culture was very similar. It's why we're Great Britain and they're Brittany. We're Big Brittany, they're Little Brittany. So there was a huge crossover in a lot of ways. So I don't think it's a big surprise that we share a wrestling background. I think it's maybe a surprise that both have survived and look very similar still.
Are there still competitions for that nowadays?
I don't know. I'd like to think so, but I've got some friends over in Brittany that do some traditional French wrestling, not Breton wrestling, kind of the forerunner of Greco-Roman, and they don't know much about the scene in Breton wrestling. So I hope it's still going on, but I genuinely don't know. The most recent thing I have is a book, I think, that was written in maybe the early 80s that had some historical pictures and photos of teams that had got together in the 40s, 50s, maybe 60s. So I genuinely don't know, but I'd like to think so.
So then we have that, but there are other styles as well.
Yeah, absolutely. The next is Cumberland and Westmoreland wrestling, which comes from an area up by the Scottish borders on the northwest side. So effectively what is now the Lake District and that southern Scottish borders area around Dumfries and Galloway. And that's a style that is very similar to what now we do as Scottish backhold wrestling. So you start in an over and under clinch with your hands clasped behind your opponent's back. So you have that. You both have exactly the same starting position, and then the goal is to throw your opponent. But it's a little bit more complicated than that because if you break your grip before your opponent gets lower than your knees, then they win. So a way of beating your opponent is to force them to break their grip. But as you throw them, if you manage to get a throw, as you put them down, you're allowed to then break your grip as they hit the ground, A, because it protects your hand, and B, it was considered ungentlemanly to land on your opponent. So what tended to happen is you'd throw your opponent, and as they went to hit the ground, you'd open your hands and cartwheel off, and then you'd end up next to them, not on them. And it's first down to lose. And that was a style that was taken up by an association of wrestlers in London, and it kind of became the predominant style for quite a long time. And when we hear about,
so it's very limited, actually. Like you lock yourself into that position.
Yes, it really is. But it's one of those styles that everybody, as soon as you tell anybody that anything about the style, they go, "Oh, that's really limited. I don't really see the use of that."
But I didn't say that.
No. I'm very aware that you didn't say that, but I've had this conversation with quite a few people. But like anything that's very limited, it becomes incredibly specialized. And I'm constantly amazed that we're not seeing more people in the world of MMA searching out things like Scottish backhold or Cumberland and Westmoreland wrestling, because there are people teaching it at a high level. There are still Scottish backhold wrestling competitions all across Scotland, and it's done outside on the grass wearing a kilt. Usually people wear a pair of shorts underneath the kilt, but not always. But it's fantastic for clinch work. If you get in somebody and you can get that over under clinch and you can lock it in place, usually there's not a lot that goes on in MMA. You get someone up against the cage and you maybe kind of jab them with your shoulder, or you try and move them around so that you can do something else to them. But that's what Cumberland and Westmoreland wrestling is. That's the whole point of it. So there's all sorts of lovely, subtle moves that you can do in those systems that are really, I think it's kind of, I don't know, the margins for progression and for improvement in MMA have become so small that something like that, I think, may be a bit of a secret weapon waiting to be found. So what else do we have? We have Norfolk wrestling, which is very similar to Devon and Cornwall. It's never really considered to be a particularly viable system. I think it just died out a little bit earlier and was kind of swept away by the movement for Cumberland and Westmoreland. And the last is Lancashire wrestling, which is effectively what we've already talked about. But the thing that makes Lancashire wrestling different, the two things that make Lancashire wrestling different, firstly, is that there is no specific starting hold. So there's no limit on how you take hold of your opponent when you begin to wrestle. You catch as catch can, effectively. So it was known as a catch hold system.
Catch in this context meaning
as in to take hold of. And the other thing that made it different is that it wasn't first down losers. The idea was that in traditional Lancashire wrestling, you had to hold your opponent down. You had to be able to not just put them on the floor, but show that you could hold them on the floor.
Was it a 3-second pin?
Well, there's some variation in that, and I mean, even now, the people that are doing this tend to work the pin in very different ways. So I'd be very hesitant to say that there was any kind of formal agreed rule set. A lot of these things were just decided at the time, or whoever happened to be refereeing the match would decide if you'd held them for long enough. And now, as organisations are starting to put catch wrestling competitions out there, we're starting to see some of these become a little bit more formalised. So the Snake Pit up in Wigan have been doing some fairly good competitions for quite a few years now.
Yeah.
And they recently put on their World Championships, which was a huge success. They got teams from all over the world turning up. They have a relatively fast 3-second count for a pin. And, that's fine, because it just means you've got to be a little bit more athletic and a little bit faster and a little bit better at escaping that pin or not getting pinned in the first place. I know that the American Catch Wrestling Association, Josh Barnett's thing tends to be a slightly longer pin. You've got to literally hold for a count of 1, 2, 3, tap. But the fact is, it's a very subtle difference. The art's pretty much the same. So where were we? I think that's it. I think that the one thing that's really interesting to note is that there's round about sort of 1880 to 1920, the histories get really, really messy, even though we've got a lot of documentary evidence. And at that point, we have Yuki Otani and Sadokazu Uyenishi coming over from Japan and introducing Japanese Jiu-Jitsu to the kind of the wrestling scene in the UK. And there's a lot of...
I'm assuming they did the same thing that the Gracies did, which was basically trick wrestlers into putting on the gi and then using the gi.
Yes and no. I mean,
Really?
the fact is that we had a lot of jacketed wrestlers. In the
That's
UK
true.
at least, starting from a specific grip or using a jacket.
But it doesn't sound like the jacketed wrestling continued on the ground.
No, but most of there's a lot of kind of anecdotes about jiu-jitsu tricks, and one of the wonderful things we've got in Uyanishi's book, because he wrote a book in about 1920 it was published. And we've actually got in the book, instead of just a picture of the technique, they've filmed it with a really early camera, and we've got these reels of frame by frame pictures of throws being done by Uyanishi on British wrestlers at the time. So we can actually see what these guys were doing. Clearly, it looks much more like judo or Brazilian jiu-jitsu. And a lot of the kind of the traditional Japanese jiu-jitsu that's being done, at least in the UK, has moved away from that a little bit. But again, it's this fascinating look. But we've got this huge crossover at this point, because they were using arm bars and chokes and techniques like that, Americanas, or the double wrist lock, the Kimura. Obviously, we didn't call it a Kimura then. But so submitting to a pain hold or a lock or a choke was suddenly a very important thing to do, and that's where we start getting this messy mix of intermingling of different styles, and we don't know whether wrestlers tapped or submitted verbally or anything, or whether it was the umpire, the referee, that had to decide that you'd had enough. We just don't know.
So prior to the Japanese judoka and jiu-jitsuka arriving in England, was Lancashire wrestling using submissions to achieve the pin?
I wish I could answer that question conclusively.
I've not found...
no. The evidence to say it was is relatively subtle and possibly a little sketchy. There are the vast majority of people, and the vast majority of the evidence would say not. However, there are some clear but rare examples of people submitting.
Well, you see that now in freestyle wrestling.
Yes, absolutely.
You see people tapping out to front headlocks. You see people who are in pain, and there have been wrestlers like the Schultz, like Dave Schultz and Mark Schultz, who basically put submissions into their Olympic wrestling.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and that was definitely a thing. And I know I became friends for a while with a guy called Marty Jones, who's a very classic English pro wrestler from back in the 80s. He and a couple of other people effectively created this acrobatic, showy wrestling that is what we know today. But he trained under Billy Robinson when he was a boy, and was a British amateur champion wrestler as well. And I persuaded him to come and do some seminars with us on kind of the catch that he grew up with. And he was absolutely adamant that there were no submissions in catch, but then proceeded to hurt us all more than we'd ever been hurt before. And it's like, I mean, technically we're not tapping to a submission, but I mean, if it was an option, I would. So
was the idea of that early 20th century catch to use the submission to force the back exposure and to force the pin?
Yes, absolutely. There's definitely some clear evidence of people using pain compliance techniques to force people into a pin position to be able to get that. We know that for sure because we can see in certain rule sets that it's banned. And the one thing we can say for certain is that you're never going to ban something unless people are doing it. So there's clear evidence that some people were doing it, but again, there's very much two schools of thought. Were people deliberately using pain to move people into a pin, or were they trying to move people into a pin and the pain was incidental? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, some moves like the step over toe hold, that was a huge part of catch wrestling, and it's a different toe hold from what jiu-jitsu guys think of as a toe hold.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it doesn't make any sense unless the person's trying to avoid getting pinned by staying in essentially a turtle position or referee's position.
I'm glad you said that, because it raises a really interesting point. Something that I've completely failed to mention is that there are effectively two very discrete kind of lineages of catch wrestling that look very similar, but are in actual fact quite different.
Okay.
You've got the British catch wrestling that stems from Lancashire wrestling that I've effectively is what I've been talking about completely. But you've also got the American catch wrestling, which kind of became a thing in the carnival scene, where a carnival would have champion wrestlers and you'd come and try your hand against them. We had that in England, but it wasn't anything like the same. It was much more boxing orientated than wrestling orientated. But you can see a lot of the very famous early American wrestlers, people like Farmer Burns and Frank Gotch, and these guys were carnival wrestlers first and foremost. But the kind of the whole culture of that, because of the way it's done, means that you have to do it differently. If you've got two guys who were coal miners that happened to be good at wrestling, fighting to see who was the best, and everyone they knew was putting money down on the fight, there was no time limit on that, and the two would literally fight for as long as it took. And if that took all night, it took all night. If they had to stop, go home, and come back again the next day and start again and fight for 2 or 3 days to find out who was best, then that's what they'd do. And that leads to a very different style of wrestling than the style where you've got a crowd of people who you've G'd up to want to get involved, and the more of them you can kind of get through the gate, the more money you make. So at that point, you need to win quickly. So a lot of these kind of aggressive submission techniques that we see in catch wrestling are used in both, but are used in very different ways. So you could say...
That being said, when was it Frank Gotch fought Hackenschmidt in the United States, that was something like a 2.5 hour fight.
Yeah, no,
so
absolutely.
The public again, did have, like, they weren't quite as tick-tocked out then as they are now. They were willing to watch 4-hour-long presidential debates where people went home for dinner before coming back to hear the rebuttal.
Absolutely.
And longer.
I think the only thing I can say with any absolute certainty that's 100% true is that there's nothing in catch wrestling that is absolutely 100% true. And we can say that the American carnival scene of catch wrestling tended towards faster, more aggressive bouts, because you needed the person to give in, and you needed them to give in loudly and clearly so everybody knew. Right. But that doesn't mean that American catch wrestling was always fast. And the same,
it's also a difference when you've got two elite guys fighting versus the elite guy and some schmo who came in from the lumber camp and is a bit drunk.
And the fact is that the whole carnival scene was rigged from the very start, and the chances of anybody ever really beating the system were almost non-existent. It did happen. And I think it might have been Farmer Burns, Martin Burns, that did it. That he kind of... It may not have been him. I might be getting my history muddled up, but I think he lost a match relatively early on as a kid or a teenager, and he trained himself up and up and up and went back into the carnival scene and effectively demolished the carnival champions. So it did happen, but again, it was pretty rare.
How did these two lineages of catch evolve? Like, how did they split up?
Well, I mean, I don't think anybody knows for certain. The most obvious thing is that because most of the sailing to the US from the UK, when effectively the US was a British colony, was done from the northwest, and that's where catch wrestling was big. That it probably went across with that, but it may have been a simultaneous evolution. But I very much doubt it. I think there was enough kind of cross-pollination between the two to get a lot of the same techniques and the same styles. And the fact that rough and tumble looks very much like up and down fighting, from what we can say, and the fact that American catch looks very much like British catch can, I think we can say for certain that there is a connection. What it is, I don't know for sure. There are some theories being battered around, but nobody's put any source material in front of me. Nobody's quoted their sources enough that I can look at it and say, yeah, you're absolutely right. This clearly says what you say it says. It's all circumstantial at best.
Well, let's talk about the Japan connection, because really most of what we see today in catch wrestling, at least in the context of MMA, has probably been filtered through Japan, both with people like Karl Gotch, not Frank Gotch, but Karl Gotch going to Japan and ending up training the whole Shuto lineage.
Yep. Absolutely.
And then that coming back to the United States through Yuri Nakamura and teaching at the Inosanto Academy, but then also Billy Robinson and his involvement with Sakuraba. And I don't think you could make a strong argument that the most successful catch wrestler of the last 50 years is Sakuraba.
Yeah, I think you could certainly argue that. I mean, I might put Josh Barnett up there with him. But I think, in all honesty, Sakuraba was probably a better catch wrestler, and Josh is a better all-round fighter. But anyway, that's by the by. I think it's really interesting, and I think it's probably not a coincidence that the people in kind of this Western world, America and Western Europe, have adopted the Japanese arts of combat, and in Japan they've adopted the equally esoteric and exotic European and American arts. And I know that Billy at least travelled around a lot as a wrestler, and he settled in Japan because they wanted to learn what he had to teach, and the kind of the wrestling culture there was huge, and almost every successful wrestler from that period went and spent time out in Japan. And I think
let's start with how Billy Robinson learned catch wrestling.
Okay, well, Billy Robinson as a child wanted to be a boxer. His grandfather was a bare knuckle boxing champion, and Billy wanted to follow in his footsteps. The story, as Billy tells it, is that while they were kids and they were messing around, somebody threw like a flat sheet of tin of some sort, and it hit him in the face, and it damaged his eye quite badly. And he was basically told, "You're never going to box." And at that point, he persuaded his father to take him along to a local wrestling gym instead. His family were all fighters, and they all kind of they knew the area, they knew the wrestlers, they knew the boxers. So it wasn't really a big stretch for Billy to move into wrestling rather than boxing. And the person that he went along to train with was a guy called Billy Riley, who had his own wrestling gym, just known as Riley's Gym. And to call it a wrestling gym would be a massive exaggeration. It was, in effect, a hut. It was just wooden plank walls with nails banged into them that you hung your gear on, and that was pretty much it. There were mats on the floor, and what you had is an old boy called Billy Riley who used to coach wrestling in his suit and shirt and tie, and usually with his hat on still as well. Excuse me. And that's where Billy Robinson went. And we've got some really early footage. If you get onto YouTube and have a look around, the guys at the Snake Pit have used quite a lot of it in some of their videos. You can see Billy Riley teaching young kids, and you can see Billy Robinson there. He's probably in his early 20s. And he's got a bit of swagger to him. You know, when somebody walks into the gym and they know that they're the best there. They know they're good. And you can see him coaching some of the kids. And in amongst the kids, you can see people like Marty Jones, who was probably 10, 11 years old at the time, sort of sitting at the side, looking a bit wide-eyed. And Billy effectively stayed there, and he trained with people like Billy Riley, some of the other wrestlers. Billy Joyce was a former British champion who Billy Robinson always said that he was the toughest man he'd ever fought, and the only reason that he beat him is because of the age difference, and Joyce's kind of star was waning as Billy Robinson's star rose.
And they were training catch wrestling or Lancashire
Yes,
wrestling.
absolutely. They were training catch as catch can out of Billy Riley's gym at that point. This was what Olympic wrestling was at the time.
Really? So Olympic
Yeah, oh,
wrestling
absolutely.
had.
Yeah. If you go back 100 years and you look at the Olympics, then that you had catch as catch can. That was the wrestling. Um, I'm not sure when Greco-Roman came in, but effectively, yeah, it was catch as catch can wrestling
With the various neck twists and
yeah.
arm locks and.
Originally, yes, absolutely, yeah. Over time, it's become a
Sure.
little bit more sanitized and a little bit safer, and it's branched off into, probably because the American wrestling scene was so dominant with high school wrestling and collegiate wrestling, and it created this whole kind of culture of freestyle wrestling and folk style wrestling, and that effectively took over. But freestyle and folk style are both derived from catch as catch can, in much the same way that pro wrestling is derived from catch as catch can.
And just to locate us in time, at what era is Billy Robertson training with Billy Riley at the Snake Pit?
In the 50s.
Okay.
50s and 60s. And Billy Robinson, he basically won everything that there was to win as an amateur. But the issue with being an amateur wrestler is that you don't earn any money doing it. So he turned pro and was effectively then doing show wrestling, but had a bit of a reputation for being a bit of a hard guy.
So when you say show wrestling, would that be pro wrestling? Would that be the...
Absolutely, yeah,
Okay.
yeah, absolute pro wrestling.
So prearranged outcomes.
Yes,
for most of it.
Mostly. Every now and again, you hear about that somebody did something they shouldn't, and it became an actual shoot. And you hear quite a lot of stories about wrestlers actually wrestling beforehand to decide who was the best wrestler, to decide then who would win when they did their pro bout. So it's a really interesting thing, because people write pro wrestling off as being fake, and it always makes me a little bit cross because it's fixed, it's not fake. And there are still quite a few pro wrestlers out there now that are quite big in the wrestling scene that are proper catch as catch can wrestlers, and they're perfectly able to do this stuff for real, and they're hamming it up for the show. But it's effectively live professional stunt work as entertainment rather than fake. So I get a bit tetchy when people start writing it off as not being a real fighting thing. So, well, give it a try, and then tell me it's not real fighting. I've completely lost track. I've no idea where I was going with this. So
we had Billy Robertson about to go pro.
Right, yes, absolutely. So at that point, he was a regular on the 1970s and 1980s World of Sport on British weekend television. We'd have a couple of hours of pro wrestling. There were some huge names, people like Big Daddy, Shirley Crabtree was his actual name, Giant Haystacks, Mick McManus, Marty Jones, Billy Robinson. These were all guys that were part of it. And I mean, when I grew up watching this stuff on telly. It was like the highlight of my week. And people like Big Daddy were my hero. And when I look back at it now, I can see quite clearly that Billy Robinson, who I didn't care about at all at the time, is a serious wrestler, and Big Daddy just used to fall on people, which ironically is very similar to my grappling style. But so in effect, he took the wrestling knowledge he had and he made it his living. And he used that to travel around the world and go to wrestling shows all over the world. And what he'd try and do is go to where he knew good wrestlers were. So he traveled to the Middle East, he traveled to America, he traveled to Russia, he traveled to the Far East, to Japan, and he effectively searched out people who were supposed to be great wrestlers, so he could wrestle with them and see who was actually the best. And in the end, he settled down in Japan coaching, and just disappeared off the radar for most of us. there are a few people out there, obviously people like Minoru Suzuki and Josh Barnett, Eric Paulson, were aware of him and involved with him to some degree. But he was very happy doing that. And then after a while, he moved from Japan back to America, where his son was in the military. And he settled down in a little house in Little Rock, Arkansas, and did some coaching in the local MMA gym. And like half a dozen people in the gym knew who he was and how amazing he was. And it wasn't until Jake Shannon tracked him down and persuaded him to effectively come out of retirement and start coaching in a big way again that the world...
Jake Shannon, author of Say Uncle, which I've got here on the shelf as well.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think anybody that's involved in catch wrestling owes Jake a huge debt, because without Jake, we wouldn't have had Billy's input into the revival. Whether it would have died or whether it would have come in through another way, I don't know. But one of the most amazing things that Jake managed to pull off was he working with a guy called Andy Crittenden, who's a martial arts instructor up in Yorkshire, managed to put on a big enough event to pay the expenses to get Billy back over to the UK for the first time in years. And they did a bit of a tour, and they met up with some of the old names and his old friends from when he was a kid, and that, yeah, that kind of that's when I met him, when he came over for this. They did I'm just trying to think whether they did they did a 3-day camp, but I don't know if they did the first year he came. I went to do a seminar, and immediately it's like, okay, I have to do more of this. So the next year I went back and did a 3-day camp with Billy, which was probably the most brutal thing that I've ever done in my life.
Why was it brutal?
Just constant. And Billy was an unbelievably hard taskmaster. I mean, he was a lovely guy when you spoke to him, but he didn't accept anything but perfection when you were on the mats. And I mean, in fairness, I mean, you've been injured and ill, and I have too, and it's really difficult to try and teach somebody how to do a physical skill when you're not able to just do it and show them. And I think that Billy struggled a lot with that, and he was probably a little bit grumpier than he should have been. Talking to Josh Barnett, he said Billy was never grumpy with him. And I wonder if that's because he knew him when he was younger, or just because Josh Barnett's significantly more talented than me. But he'd demonstrate, or he'd get his coaches, Jake Shannon, a guy called Sam Cressin, who everyone in the world of grappling should know, but nobody does. I think he's a 3rd or 4th degree black belt in jiu-jitsu, as well as the only person that I've ever seen Billy Robinson say did a technique brilliantly. But you'd effectively you'd be trying to drill a technique, and Billy would just shout "stop," and literally everybody in the room would freeze, because the first time he says stop, everyone just lets go and stands up and looks at him. And the first time we all did that, he just lost his mind, because it's like, how can I possibly tell you what it is you're doing wrong if you move? So when he'd say stop, literally everybody in the room would just freeze. Mid-throw, whatever you were, you'd just stop. And you'd see him stand up and start shuffling over the mats with this very strange multi-footed walking stick that he had. So he could let go of it and it would stand upright. And if he walked past you, you knew you were safe. And if he didn't, then he'd come over, and it would be something so small that you were doing wrong. Just your hand was a couple of inches out of position, or when you were stepping through, your foot wasn't quite pointed the right way. And at the time, I mean, there was one particular throw, a variant on a fireman's carry throw, and I could not get it for love nor money. I couldn't do it. Whether it was just because it didn't work with my physique, whether my brain wasn't with it, or whether I was just tired and fed up and hungry after 3 days of 8-9 hours a day wrestling, but I couldn't get it. And I could see he was getting more and more frustrated, and I was getting more and more frustrated. Couldn't do it. And literally, I'm down in this position, trying to hold this guy, and he's saying, "No, move your hand. No, not that hand. The other hand. No, don't move it that way. Move it the other way." And at which point he starts hitting me with his stick, not hard, but hard enough that you. But he was always right. And that's probably the most sickening thing. You'd be doing a technique and it just wouldn't quite work, or it didn't flow quite as well as you wanted. And he'd get you to move your hand maybe an inch or two, and you'd do it again, and it would just work. And he had such an amazing understanding of how people move and how you can utilize that to make them move in a way that you want them to move. And he never claimed that he would teach you to wrestle. He just claimed that he would teach you how to learn to wrestle. And I like to think that he probably did, but yeah, I'm probably bigging myself up a little there.
Is that sort of, call it grumpy, and some people might call it slightly abusive style of teaching, is a little bit reminiscent of when you see footage of Sayama, the guy who was behind Shootwrestling, coaching his very, very unfortunate students. And I don't know if that footage, if people have seen it, it's incredible. Like, Sayama's just kicking these poor kids as hard as he can, or hitting them with a stick and yelling at them and just breaking them down. I don't know to what extent that was show for some documentary to maintain a persona, or to what extent that was Sayama's teaching style. And like, that goes from a little bit abusive to really quite abusive. And maybe Billy spent a whole bunch of time in Japan and absorbed it through
possibly.
that.
It's certainly possible that's where that came from. Maybe it's part of that culture, and he just picked it up and went with it. And most of the kind of that early generation of Japanese wrestlers have a reputation for being really hard, really brutal, really difficult to train with. That you're gonna suffer. People like Fujiwara, Yoshiaki Fujiwara was, and still is, an absolute monster. But
See, I never trained with that generation, but I remember training with one or two generations after, with Minoa. And he was lovely to train with. Like, you'd roll and you'd roll, and then you'd come close to catching him at something, and then he would go to 100%, and then he would go back to like rolling like a little baby. It was this weirdest. It was lovely to train with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suspect mainly it was out of frustration with Billy,
Not being able to do what he used to be able to do.
Yeah, and the fact that it. And when I broke my leg and I couldn't wrestle at all for years, I was really frustrated. And I am at my very peak a mediocre wrestler. I discovered it far too late to ever be any good at it. But Billy was the best. And to go from being this person that everybody knew, there's a Japanese action figure based on him, that he was in Hollywood films, he was hanging out with royalty, he was a global A-list superstar, all because of wrestling. And then he got stuck in a dodgy little gym in Doncaster up in Yorkshire with a bunch of second-rate,
or in Arkansas.
Well, yeah, absolutely. So you can understand why he'd been a bit frustrated, but the fact is, he kick-started this catch as catch can revolution.
So what was his relationship with Sakuraba like? And for people who don't know, Sakuraba defeated 4 Gracies in an era when Gracies were not really supposed to be ever defeated. And he beat them quite convincingly.
Yes. I don't know in any great detail, if I'm being honest. I spent a bit of time socially with Billy, but not any huge amount. I know he used to refer to Sakuraba as my boy Sakuraba. And you can clearly see a huge influence when you've trained with Billy or seen the DVDs which are out there. They're pretty poor quality by today's standards, production wise, but they're
the information's still good.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's still Billy Robinson teaching these techniques, and a lot of it's very fundamental stuff, and it's been kind of absorbed into the giant meta world of grappling now. But some of the details are very interesting, and some of the approaches, his reliance and his love of the double wrist lock. Was something that he drilled into to me and the group of people I was training with him,
And
and
that
you
was
can
certainly
see.
a huge part of Sakuraba's
Well, absolutely.
arsenal.
You can see that with Sakuraba. That's how he won what he did. You can see Josh Barnett doing, I think it's a double wrist lock takedown against Andrei Orlovsky
Uh,
when they fought, and it's that's just pure Billy. I mean, I was taught that very technique by Billy Robinson the first time I ever trained with him, and then I see a UFC champion doing it to another UFC champion, and I think it's people write it off because it's connected to pro wrestling, because it's very fragmented, and there's no coordination. There's no catch wrestling doesn't work together, and I think that's a real shame.
what do you mean doesn't work together?
Um, I think when people started trying to kind of recreate it, and you had probably half a dozen different groups around the world, all kind of starting at about the same time. There's the scientific wrestling, the Snake Pit, the Snake Pit US, which is not connected to the Snake Pit in Wigan, and some of the Japanese schools, and everyone's trying to recreate this, and you've got you went through a period where there was a lot of politics and a lot of people were running other people down because they were from a different organization, and the fact is we all had the same goal at the end of the day, and I think it's taken a few years for a lot of that to settle down, and a few people that were maybe stirring the pot a little have moved away, and we've got people that were consistently doing it and have just carried on consistently doing it. Roy Wood at the Snake Pit as a great example. Josh Barnett as a great example. There's a guy called Chris Crossan who trains up in the northeast in the UK. He's a fantastic catch wrestler. Um,
How
and
does he
does it.
look different when he puts his catch wrestling hat on as opposed to his jiu-jitsu hat?
Um, it's it, I guess you probably have to feel it. And you know the difference between rolling against somebody who's got a really strong wrestling base and rolling against somebody who's got a really strong jiu-jitsu base and has never wrestled. It just feels different, right?
Yeah. Judo
And
too. Judo's got that distinct flavor that, like,
yes, yes,
dude, you've
absolutely,
done judo, because it's just that in in that case, it's this explosive movement followed by extreme static,
yes,
very, very
absolutely.
strong
Yeah,
holds.
I can't move you.
Yeah.
You know you're a judo guy, but it's I mean, Chris is very very heavily involved in CSW with Eric Paulson now, and I think he's a 3-stripe black belt under Eric. But and Chris is, in all honesty, a very multi-skilled grappler. He's a jiu-jitsu black belt. He's a catch wrestling coach. He's a sambo guy. He's a judo guy. He's done it all. But whenever you talk to him, he's using everything to kind of help develop the catch wrestling. That's his thing. His group is legit pro wrestling, and he's trying to bring back a bit of that legitimacy to something that everybody writes off.
Well,
So
it's funny because catch wrestling, in terms of it being legitimate, there's always been two parts of it. There's been, the catch wrestling that was done at lumber camps to see who was the toughest guy, and the catch wrestling that was turned into pro wrestling where the outcome was predetermined, and we're going to have this stunt contest. And that, in a certain sense, we can call it illegitimate at the risk of offending you. It's certainly very different from a contested thing. And in the
yes,
same way, there are people who have legitimate catch wrestling credentials, and then there are other people, I want to say Matt Fury, 25 years ago, who jumped onto this because they didn't have, just as grappling was becoming popular because of the UFC, they didn't have the jiu-jitsu credentials to, at that time, it would be tracked back to the Gracies. They couldn't say, well, this guy taught this guy taught this guy taught me. So now they were releasing products literally based on, I was walking and I had a dream and the ghost of Farmer Burns appeared to me. Farmer Burns is a famous American catch wrestler, and revealed to me all his secrets in the dream. And now I'm making it a VHS tape and selling it for $200 to show you the secrets of Farmer Burns. I'm not making this up. So that's the legitimate and illegitimate sides of it yet again.
I think, I mean, I don't know Matt Fury. I don't know the thing. I don't doubt you for a second. But I'm gonna.
I'm just gonna say that. Which is not to say that there aren't people who've trained with him who aren't legit.
Yes, absolutely.
Because if you take something and you work really hard at it and you're open-minded and you need some kind of lineage, well, I guess I'll tie myself to this Matt Fury guy or whoever. But I'm going to train my ass off. You can start at, I'll go out there and say it, an illegitimate source, and make it legitimate through hard work, blood, sweat, and tears.
Yes.
And orthopedic injuries.
Yeah, absolutely. And there have definitely been people out there selling catch wrestling without really ever having done catch wrestling. But I guess there's it kind of leads on to another issue that is lineage important? I mean, myself coming from a HEMA background, there is no lineage. So, I mean, I can say that
you're a direct descendant of the sword fighting style of Casanova.
People have said worse things in order to try and give themselves some credibility. But, you know, I mean, I can say I trained under Billy Robinson. You know, I discovered catch wrestling through him. I've trained under Billy Robinson. I've trained under Roy Wood. I've trained under Marty Jones. I've trained under Josh Barnett. It doesn't actually mean anything. You know, if I can't either do it or pass that information on to other people, or preferably both, it's irrelevant, right?
Yeah.
And that's partly what the issue with the catch wrestling community was, that there was this whole, because people were claiming things that weren't necessarily accurate, that suddenly you've got a, well, can you prove it? And then it leads to the fact that the best people out there can turn around to everyone else and say, well, you're not a proper catch wrestler. And at that point, it's like, well, how many jiu-jitsu gyms are out there doing really well, producing decent fighters that aren't the best jiu-jitsu fighters? You know, there's got to be a hierarchy. And yes, you can look at people like Ian Jones, who trained at the Snake Pit, Ian Mongoose Jones, fantastic wrestler, absolutely brilliant, very skilled grappler. Chris Crossan, some of these other guys, they're great. But do you have to be as good as them to then be able to teach it? And I'd say probably not, to be honest. You know, we don't.
How many heavyweight titles did Angelo Dundee ever win?
Well, absolutely. You know,
Zero.
I mean, how many of us train under Roger Gracie on a regular basis?
Yeah.
You know, in the world of jiu-jitsu, not many.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that we aren't improving and getting better at it and spreading the word and developing techniques and actually.
But there are people who are great fighters and not good coaches, and there are people who are good coaches and not great fighters. Sometimes it's the same.
Yeah.
But not always. I mean, would you rather train under Mike Tyson's coach who made Mike Tyson or under Mike Tyson?
Well, yeah. No,
maybe it depends how high Mike Tyson is.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, I'm with you 100%. I think it's hopefully it's changing now, and I think that there's enough people starting to do catch now that we're going to get kind of pro level catch gyms, and we're going to get lower level gyms where people can come along and start to learn the art. And if they're good at it, just like with MMA, you go to your local MMA club in town and you train, and if you've got some talent and you progress well, you get better than those coaches can make you, and you move on to a better gym and you go somewhere else, and you know, and that's I think how combat sports should work. There are always going to be hobbyists, and there are always going to be competitors, and there are always going to be people that don't really know which they are, but just want to turn up and
brawl.
Yeah, just roll.
Can you give some examples of specific catch wrestling strategies or techniques that have been brought into MMA and brought into no-gi grappling in the current no-gi meta that people might take for granted as something that has always existed? but that hasn't.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the obvious and most clear example is leg locks. Leg locks aren't in jiu-jitsu. They are now, but they came into jiu-jitsu through catch wrestling. And
There are photos of Helio Gracie doing straight ankle locks from the 1950s, standing, otherwise known as ironically, the pro wrestling version of the leg lock that never actually works unless you're doing it on a very small child.
There are, but I would argue that the Gracies are very much a mix of catch wrestling and jiu-jitsu from the very start. And the fact is, Maeda was a pro wrestler. He was Konde Koma, Count Combat.
Yeah.
He was a pro wrestler that was also a jiu-jitsu guy, and he traveled the world as a pro wrestler. You can't look at him and say,
and so was Kimura.
Pure jiu-jitsu.
So was Kimura. Kimura was a very legitimate judoka, but by the time that he made it to Brazil, he was a pro wrestler. And
absolutely,
judo people are still ashamed of that their judo god, Kimura, went and did pro wrestling and let's not talk about this because this is embarrassing.
I mean, even worse than that, if you read Kano's memoirs, he's really clear that there was when he was young and he was learning from as many different jiu-jitsu schools as he could. There was a guy he simply couldn't beat. He couldn't beat this guy. Nothing he had in his armory got him to. So he went off to the library and he started studying old Western wrestling books. And from that, he took a fireman's carry throw, flying mare, I think it is in English wrestling, which became Katagurama. And then now it's just a standard judo throw. But that, I mean, Kano brought that into his art from wrestling. So there's been a cross-pollination from the very beginning. So you can look at it and say, okay, well, here's a picture from 70 years ago of one of the kind of the pioneers of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu doing a leg lock. But look at what the guys that Danaher is churning out are doing. Look at, so, every region, every gym's got their leg lock guy now, because leg locks are just a thing. But 10, 15 years ago, leg locks were kind of seen as this black magic and you shouldn't do it. And that's not right. That's not proper jiu-jitsu. That you can't do that. And now it's just part and parcel.
And the only guys who did were the guys who had a catch wrestling or a sambo background.
To start off with, absolutely, yeah.
Or Shuto, which is sort of related to both of those.
This open source nature of grappling is lovely because there's been a huge amount of innovation around leg locks because now, I don't know, 100 times as many people are doing them. And some of these guys are brilliant. They're not from catch at all, but they're doing techniques that were brought into jiu-jitsu from catch, and they're changing them and adapting them and improving them, and you end up with better technique. Is it catch? No. Is it jiu-jitsu? Well, only because jiu-jitsu people say it is.
I would argue that the double wrist lock or the Kimura countered, especially to things like the single leg takedown, that's pretty standard now in submission grappling.
Yes.
But if you want the sources of people doing that, you're going to look to books like this,
yep.
The Science of Wrestling and the Art of Jiu-Jitsu, which was published in 1923.
Yeah.
That's got techniques like that. And the double wrist lock / Kimura, that came from the wrestling part of that book. It didn't come from the jiu-jitsu part.
And the technique exists within judo. But the kind of the variety and the way it's used and the subtleties of it are very much catch. And even now, I hate the way Kimuras are taught in jiu-jitsu a lot of the time. It just feels loose and it feels far less effective than the double wrist lock stuff that I was taught.
That being said, this book by Earl Lieberman, when he shows Kimura, and I look at it, I go, man, that's wrong. Like maybe Lieberman wasn't a double wrist lock specialist and was writing a book like, okay, I need to take some photos of this, and here's kind of how to do it. Okay, don't move. But the actual grip leaves a ton of room for the guy to escape.
Yes.
So if I had to base my entire knowledge of catch wrestling off of this one book from 100 years ago, I would go, these guys were idiots. They don't know
Yeah,
and I'm sure he was good at some things. Maybe this is an area that he wasn't so good at.
Well, and interestingly, and again, it's going back to HEMA. We can look at these medieval manuscripts of people doing techniques, and in some of them, clearly, the person writing the technique is not the same as the person drawing the pictures, and some of them clearly the pictures were drawn first, and the person writing the description of the technique is literally correcting the picture. So I think that you can't put too much credence on a picture. And you look at the guy doing the double wrist lock in your book, and maybe that's not how he actually did it, but maybe that just happened to be the best photo.
Yeah, I totally agree. You don't really have the backstory.
No.
So if you could wave a magic wand and direct 10 gyms across the world to be your incubator, what would be some training methods or strategies or techniques from traditional English wrestling systems that you'd like to have them train and deploy and field test? I mean, you talked about the locked grip over under. What style of wrestling was that again?
That was Cumberland and Westmoreland and Scottish backhold, which are effectively the same style.
All right. So you've asked your magic incubator gyms, your 10 gyms. Okay, I want you guys to study the existing techniques and go train with coaches of Cumberland and Westmoreland and Scottish backhold wrestling. What are other aspects of catch or traditional English wrestling that you'd want to send out into the world to see if they work in a modern MMA or submission grappling context?
The biggest thing I would love to see is I'd love to see people fighting to a pin more often. I think that even if what you do is you look at the standard jiu-jitsu roles and you say you get points for a takedown, you get points for passing guard, you get points for mount, you get points for knee on belly, you get points for a pin. I think the fact that the pin is the ultimate in top pressure, and I think that there's a reason that the internet is full of memes of wrestlers coming out of college and just destroying jiu-jitsu fighters, and it's partly because wrestlers train really hard and they're incredibly fit and incredibly strong, and they'll just keep going and keep going and keep going, and you literally have to pin them to the floor to stop them, and I think that can only improve the art of grappling if you can control somebody enough that you can literally hold them down and hold them still. Clearly, it's not got an awful lot of real world use, but it gives you so much more ability. If you know that you can control somebody, if you know that when you get to side control on somebody, that they're not getting away, absolutely not. That gives you a little bit of freedom to start then experimenting and being a bit more innovative, right? And I guess I'd love to see that. I think neck cranks. I love them.
No.
I always get in trouble for neck cranks. But I think, we in jiu-jitsu, we do stuff that's really dangerous. We choke people out. We put people unconscious. We literally take almost every joint in the body past its limits. And then as soon as somebody sort of twists your neck a little bit, everyone starts complaining.
If you bring back neck locks or neck cranks, I'm bringing back single-digit finger locks.
Yeah, all right, fair enough. I'll be all right with that.
Biting, crying, and fake tapping.
Yeah, okay. We've all done them, but I think
years ago I was at a judo competition, and this is a total non sequitur. And there was on the ground, the gi was kind of pulled over the head, and the guy who was on top snuck his hand out underneath the big mess of gis, and he was in no danger. He was basically on the guy's back and tapped twice. So all the ref saw was his hand come out of nowhere, emerge from the gi and tap, and the ref like Mate, and awards the match to the guy who had done the tapping illicitly on the part of the other guy. And the guy on the bottom lost his mind. And I don't know how that ended, unfortunately, but it was hilarious. It's super dirty, but hilarious.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think you've got to award the innovation there a little. Sorry.
So if people are interested in learning catch wrestling as distinct from judo, jiu-jitsu, or regular wrestling, what are their options? I mean, there aren't, unless you live.
There aren't many. I mean, there are some specialist catch wrestlers out there. There aren't that many of them. In all honesty, all I'm going to do is parrot Josh Barnett's advice. And what he said to me was that, in effect, all grappling is wrestling at its heart. The rules are different, but the basic principles are exactly the same. So get on the mats and do something. But get along to seminars. Get people, if you can afford it, get somebody to come to you. Get DVDs, get instructionals online. Get as much as you can, digest it, and try it. Get out there. Get on the mats. Give it a go. And as long as you're training and you're rolling on a regular basis, it, at the very least, the worst case scenario is it'll flavour your jiu-jitsu with a little bit of catch. And I think that's never a bad thing.
Well, I think that's...
Pay me to come and teach you. I mean, that's good too.
So how do people follow you or get in touch with you if they've enjoyed what you've had to say on this and our previous episode together?
Well, I have my own YouTube channel, which is English Martial Arts. I'm on Instagram. I mean, technically I'm on Facebook, but I'm almost never actually on Facebook. So YouTube and Insta are probably the best way. But, you know, if people are interested, they want to chat, any email address that ends at englishmartialarts.com will end up in my inbox. So if you want to chat, send me an email, make it an interesting email address, and I'll let you know what the most interesting one I get is.
Okay. Oz, this was an absolute pleasure. I really enjoyed talking with you, and this was a ton of interesting information.
Stefan, thank you. It's always a joy, and I really appreciate you having me on again.